Hi, everyone. How's it going? I'm Eden of Light Cycle Astrology, and today we are going to talk about world or mundane astrology as a kind of astrology that you could practice. I'm going to share with you the approach that I take to practicing this kind of astrology, especially as this is generally the kind of content that I create every week, taking a look at the astrology coming through in a particular week or a month or a year or something like that. One thing that I've noticed is that I myself have never come across too many resources where astrologers are talking about how do they approach practicing mundane astrology or world astrology. I've taken courses through Nightlight Astrology under Adam Ellenboss, and even as the main kind of astrology content on YouTube that he creates, in the actual courses, there's nothing on it. I don't know that I've ever seen any videos or read any books. So a lot of astrologers practice this type of astrology, of course, on YouTube. If you watch my channel, of course, you know that that's primarily what I do. But I haven't come across too many resources about how do astrologers approach um, taking a look at the world astrology. And in my attempt to make my own content on this, I've realized that there's been quite a learning arc for me. So today, instead of just getting into another week of astrology, I thought, you know what, maybe let's try something different. And I'm going to share with you the way that I would normally go about looking at the astrology for, let's say, a period of like a week or something like that, and how to select the important astrology that may stand out above other astrology, or how do you go about, um, you know, interpreting things in a particular way when you are not dealing with a natal interpretation, but rather an interpretation that has to spread over, the whole world or a population in a particular area or something like that. So we're going to get into that today. I'm going to share with you the way that I do it. The disclaimer, of course, is always that I'm not going to be claiming that this is how everybody should do it or this is like the right way to do it. I'm just going to share with you the way that my practice doing it has evolved over almost 3 years now of me attempting to do this. And again, without anybody, without taking any kind of formalized courses or reading any books on it, just really kind of, jumping into the deep end and attempting to do it with with the knowledge that I did formally learn about traditional Hellenistic Western astrology. So before we get into it, though, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Let me know in the comments if this is content that you guys like seeing me do instead of just regular mundane astrology week in and week out. And maybe I can make more videos like this. But I would love to hear what you guys think. And we will also be, if this is a popular kind of thing, maybe I can do more of these. You can always go to lightcycleastrology.com if you want to get a hold of me or inquire about a reading. That's the place to find it. You can always email me directly at edenmabon, EDANMABON @gmail.com as well. All right. Well, normally this is the time where we would pull up the real-time clock, but I'm just going to put this big title down here for you guys. And I think I'll share my notes that I came up with. So this is just a Word document right here. And all right, there we go. So my approach here, number one, there are a few, I don't know, like maybe philosophical things that come in for me right away in terms of what I would suggest or share. Okay, the first thing is going to be, again, I'm not saying that this is the right way or this is the way we all should do it if we practice this kind of astrology. This is just my approach. And my approach has evolved and changed and sort of ping pong back and forth between one approach to another. It's really been all over the place when it's coming to the question of like, how do you do this? How does one go about saying, okay, we're looking at a span of time, say a week, there's a few things happening. What do I talk about? And broadly, the hardest thing with it is what is likely to be the thing that you notice more than maybe something else that's also happening at the same time? So, what do you notice on top of something if there's multiple aspects, multiple transits that's happening at the same time? What I've noticed in my approach to this is that a lot of times the first thing that you can get wrong, among many things that you can get wrong, is simply you thought that this one alignment was going to hit and it was going to hit hard, and then you lived through that prediction in real time, and it was like, oh, I wished I would have focused on this other astrology that was happening at the same time. So the first thing that is challenging with mundane world astrology right off the bat is just that there's almost always more than one aspect happening at the same time. And unless you're going to cover all of that and synthesize it, which is tremendously hard, I'm not going to lie, synthesizing a bunch of astrological alignments, aspects, transits, whatever, however you want to refer to them as, doing that, it becomes a kind of you're like you get into the weeds and it becomes very convoluted very quickly. So one thing that I have learned through my formal training with Adam Ellenboss is that simplicity is it's beautiful. It's if you can make something simple and easy to understand, that is the ideal. It's very easy to get stuck in the weeds, and especially when you're honing in on maybe one aspect over another. That is something that right off the bat I would recommend if you are thinking about practicing mundane astrology or you're interested in sort of dabbling in it, because it becomes really complex really quickly trying to practice this kind of astrology, because like I said, there's almost always a lot of things happening at once. So we'll get into more of how I handle this particular challenge as we go on here. But um, another thing that has to do with that is, I would say, in kind of the pecking order of that subject, I would say world astrology is a lot more subtle most of the time. Sometimes world astrology hits really hard and you really notice it, even where, like, if you know a particular alignment is happening and you're sort of conscious of it and aware of it, which is, of course, the whole point of staying up to date on what's happening and watching content on YouTube and or practicing it yourself. All of the purpose of this is to sort of um, have an awareness that it's happening so that you can participate it instead of having it smack you in the face like blindly and you had no clue. That's sort of the point of practicing mundane astrology in the first place. But what I've noticed is that it tends a lot of the time to be more subtle than, let's say, natal or horoscopic astrology or other forms of astrology. Um, I think I have an idea as to why this is. I'm not sure if this is correct, but I think one of the reasons for this is that um, mundane or world astrology, it tends to pass by. It's hanging around for a limited amount of time. But if you have somebody's birth chart and they have even a similar aspect to what you might encounter in mundane astrology, if they have that in their birth chart or in their natal chart, right? You have a lot more time to get exposure to that particular dynamic of their birth chart. If you're hanging around them, and let's say you know somebody that has a moon conjoined with Mars in their birth chart or something like that, if the more that you hang around them, the more that you're likely to get exposure to that one particular aspect of their personality, of which, of course, there are a lot of aspects to anyone's personality. But the longer that you are around that person and the more life experiences come and go, there's more of a chance to not only just sort of intuitively feel the energy of that particular aspect, but you'll also the understanding that you have from it will deepen. You'll sort of recognize, oh, the archetypes are at play because this was happening, and I could sort of understand the archetypal energies that were coming together out of the particular dynamic within this person's personality because the pressure or something like that. So you'll feel that Moon Mars conjunction during certain times, and over time you'll experience that more, and your understanding of that archetypal combination will deepen. Whereas if you're talking about a moon conjoining Mars just in a transit that everybody across the world is, of course, going to experience, the moon moves quite quickly, as we all know. The aspect might come and go. You might only be able to notice it real palpably, like for, I don't know, 4 to 6 hours or something like that. If it's the moon, maybe a day or something, maybe 2 days. But the point is that it's not so much that it doesn't work or that maybe it's even different. It's just that you don't have, a long time to get exposure to that because the transit's over pretty quickly. Even when it comes to things that are a little bit slower, like, Mercury Venus aspects, or, well, not Mercury Venus, but, like Venus Saturn aspects or something like that. You definitely notice them for sure, but you, even if you notice them or you feel them like somatically, what I've noticed is that it's like, and maybe my brain is just too slow, but you don't get a real deep understanding of it the same way that you do when you're dealing with mundane astrology. With mundane astrology, it's just, your friends, your family, your loved ones, your parents' birth charts, and you remember, oh, they have this in their birth chart. And as life goes, right, you just, your understanding of particular things in their birth chart sort of deepens, and you just go through this alchemical mental process of the archetypes, if you were, and you sort of more and more ideas get shed onto those archetypes and how they play out sometimes. So that's a big part of the difference between mundane astrology and natal horoscopic astrology, in my opinion. So that's a big part of it. Okay, a second thing is that transits when we say transits, I usually use that term for mundane astrology, but you could say alignments, planetary alignments, transits. We usually use the word aspect in mundane astrology and horoscopic astrology, but transit is, I think, a good word to use for mundane world astrology because you're talking about real time here. But transits or planetary alignments that inherently have tension, for me, seem to stand out way more than the ones that are more peaceful. So if you're going to have a trine between Venus and Jupiter, sometimes those more peaceful, less tense alignments, sometimes they're very noticeable. Sometimes they feel like a heavy drug, like you've come out of surgery and you're like, whoa, man, and you're just really like sedated. Sometimes you can get that. But I would say by and large, what I've noticed in my short 3-year practice of doing this kind of astrology is that it tends to be, unfortunately, the things that are kind of challenging or tense that seem to be noticeable over sextiles and trines, or alignments between planets that are not as tense or as dramatic, Venus and Jupiter, stuff like that. So that's what I would say. Now, I say that as with the caveat of saying it isn't that you never feel less tense aspects. But maybe this is just speaking to human nature, in that a lot of the time the human radar is sort of a lot more listening, or tuned into what are things that are um, apparently negative or stressful or something like that. Maybe that's just human nature to sort of be a little bit more aware of problematic things. I don't know. But that's one thing that I've definitely noticed, is that it seems like things that have a lot more tension, those are aspects to pay attention to a lot of the time over something that is more peaceful. Okay. Now, in terms of, okay, well, what does that look like? I have three three ranking order aspects that I would say go from most tense to least tense. And I'm going to say what they are here. You guys can see them on the screen, but I'm going to explain why I think that some of these things have more or less tension. But the first one that I feel like has the most tension is going to be the opposition. I don't know if this is the way it is in horoscopic astrology, in somebody's birth chart, if they have an opposition. Oppositions can be really, really tense in natal astrology, but I feel like the number one most tense aspect in world mundane astrology is the opposition. And the way that I relate to this, or the reason I would sort of come up with this conclusion, is because if you think about any alignment between two planets, every alignment is really just one point within a cycle between those two planets that plays out over a longer period. So let's say you have Venus square Mars or something, right? Maybe it's the opening square. Well, all you're doing is you're looking at, well, at some point Venus and Mars were in a conjunction and then they spread out, right? And then now they're making a square. They're 90 degrees away from each other. And then at some point they'll go through the opposition, and then at some point they'll go back to the square. And of course, in between there's going to be a couple of trines and some sextiles, right? And then they'll come back to the conjunction. So that whole cycle is kind of what you're looking at holistically. And then one particular alignment is simply going to be the sort of Mark Twain of like where you are in within the greater cycle. So it's like, where are we right now? Well, within the whole Venus Mars cycle, we're at the square, and it describes a kind place on the road, or like a landmark, or a signpost of where we are right now, but within the greater cycle. So we experience this all the time with the lunation cycle. So the lunation cycle for me is the easiest one to sort of relate it to. If you have an opposition within the lunation cycle, you're talking about the sun and moon being in opposition. And for me, I don't know about you guys, it's been my experience. You can share in the comments if you have a different experience. I'd love to hear if you do. But in my experience, it's generally the full moons, when the moon and the sun are in opposition, that within that whole sun moon cycle that happens for us once every month, within that lunar cycle, that one particular aspect for me is always the one that stands out. And so here's why. It seems to me that there's a lot of tension when those two planets are in opposite and they're pulling on each other. And that tension represents a kind of culmination where something has become fully realized. It's like a flower that's become totally bloomed, if that makes sense. And so you sort of get the fruits of what the whole cycle is about is appearing at that oppositional moment. So for me, that's why it stands out the most, is because you're seeing the whole cycle sort of coming to the mountain peak, and it's like, that's realized, that's what it is. So I feel like that isn't the only reason I feel like the opposition is generally the most tense standout aspect, but it's definitely a big part of it. Uh, the other reason that I mentioned just a second ago was I feel like two planets pulling on each other, not just almost fundamentally or archetypally gives you that image of tension, right? Two things sort of kind of pulling back and forth like a tug of war. I mean, that's almost the definition of tension itself, right? There's a lot of tension with something really oppositional like that. So I feel like for me, when it comes to mundane astrology, if you have one or two or three or however many things that's happening at the time, and you're looking at a week or a month or something, the oppositions are one of the ones that I pay attention to first. If I make content on the channel and there's an opposition, if it's an opposition from the moon to another planet, I might not cover it because the moon moves pretty quickly. But other than the moon and sometimes maybe Mercury and the sun, a lot of times the opposition for me, it's going to be, that's the thing I'm going to notice if I live out the week and pay attention to, remembering, okay, this is happening this week, that's happening this week, there's this other thing. Out of those ones, at the end of the week, I'll be like, wow, that Mercury opposed Mars, that's the thing that I noticed over the Sun conjunct Pluto or something like that. Like I noticed the Sun conjunct Pluto. It was definitely there. But the Mercury opposed Mars, for me, that took the essence of the forecast above the other astrology. So for me, opposition first. Okay, square is going to be the second most aspect with the most tension. Now, all of this is sort of dependent, right? I'm not saying 100% every time this is like concrete, like it's always going to be this square over a conjunction or something like that. But I would say more of the time. So not every time, but I think a lot of the time. The square has more tension built into it above other aspects like a conjunction, a trine, a sextile. I think a lot of astrologers would agree that squares are pretty tense. You can almost think of a square as sort of like the power of an opposition, but like cut in half or something, right? It's like divided by 2 or something, and you get the square. But usually in a square, one planet is to the right or earlier in zodiacal order of the second planet being to the left or later in zodiacal order. So if you have a planet in Scorpio and you have another planet in Aquarius and they're coming together into the formation of a square, it's going to be the planet in Scorpio that has a very dominating kind of effect over the planet in Aquarius. So generally speaking, now that is a traditional Hellenistic technique that we know ancient astrologers were practicing, that upon the 10th designation. So squares pack a lot of tension, and that kind of tension is really inherent a lot of times in a kind of crossroads or crisis archetypal theme. And those, again, it's just maybe being human, but those periods of crossroads or crisis tend to be things that we, are more prickly about than like hanging out on vacation at the beach, drinking a margarita or what, like whatever your like relaxing time is. We maybe get nostalgia around the relaxing stuff, but it's going to be the stuff that feels like crisis that's just going to stand out. So I feel like that's the same in mundane astrology as well. Okay, now the conjunction. The conjunction is a really interesting one. There are times I feel like where conjunctions do feel more powerful than an opposition or a square. Sometimes it depends on the planets that are involved and stuff like that. But the one thing that I would describe about the conjunction that I find really, really interesting is that a conjunction, is sort of like a birth. And going back to this concept of like, if we're talking about, let's say, Venus and Mars, and maybe Venus and Mars are in a square, well, that's just one point in the overall cycle between Venus and Mars where they have to go through the opposition, come back to a square, go through a few trines and through a couple of sextiles. And then, at some point they're in a conjunction again, and the whole thing starts over and there's a new cycle between them. So that conjunction obviously is the point at which we recognize a kind of birth or like a new cycle that's starting over. And that can be really, really powerful. That feeling of something birthing, that something that is new, something that is appearing at that time can be really powerful. So sometimes conjunctions are extremely powerful in mundane astrology. But the reason that I rank them even below the square is for one reason only, and that's that to use the example of like if you've ever had children or you're a parent, the experience of that newborn baby is profound, right? It's incredibly profound. It's very deep. Anybody that has taken care of an infant, brought the infant home from the hospital, will understand this. I'm trying to think of another analogy for people that haven't had children yet, but just even if you haven't had children, just imagine how profound it is to have that fresh born, soul, that new being that you're holding. And it's so profound. And that within itself as an experience is just beyond anything you can imagine. That's the feeling of a conjunction. But the one thing that lacks in a conjunction is that life is so new. You are hard pressed to really deeply understand what that life is going to be about at that point. It takes time, obviously, for the child to grow up, and you get to learn their personality characteristics. The nature of that child isn't easy to recognize when it's so young, when the baby's so young, or when within the conjunction between two planets. You feel it, but you don't. It's not easy to go, okay, Venus and Saturn are coming back together in a conjunction. There's about to be a whole nother Venus-Saturn cycle that plays out. You're thinking about at that moment how special it is. Maybe something's happening, but you don't know what the cycle holds in the future because it's so new. There hasn't been development for you to sort of really deeply understand what's in store in the future, in the context of that conjunction. Or going back to the infant analogy, you don't know if your newborn baby girl is going to be feisty, or if she's going to be really sweet, or if she's going to be a hard child to parent or an easy child to parent. You don't know any of those. Is she going to be good at math? Is she going to not want to take risks? Is she going to be shy, clingy? You don't know any of those things because the conjunction is so fresh. It's so new. It's just the beginning of something. I think that's pretty easy to understand, right? But it's for that reason that while conjunctions can be incredibly powerful as experiences unto themselves for that feeling of newness and depth, and for me, conjunctions are a lot more internal. They're less mind awareness, conscientiousness, and way more instinct, intuition, psychic, kind of soulful experiences. Those experiences don't rise to the mind as like a really clear, like, oh, this is what this is about kind of thing. So that's why I placed that one in the order as something that oftentimes conjunctions don't always stand out to us in comparison with squares and oppositions. Now, you might be wondering, I don't even have trines and sextiles on here. Trines and sextiles, of course, are considered to be of the least tense kinds of aspects. So they can be really, they can be noticeable, but boy, I feel like they're incredibly subtle, or if they're not subtle, it's something like something really fortunate happens, and it gets into a kind of astrology where you're just simply trying to um, hit the nail on the head, or like hit the target exactly. Like, okay, Venus trine Jupiter. Oh, your uncle's going to call you today and tell you that he wants you to take over his business because he's retiring. Like, you can't call that kind of stuff out in mundane world astrology. You have to stay away from trying to hit the target like that, because you're dealing with billions of people on the planet, and billions of people are not going to have that particular scenario take place. So for me, trines and sextiles, often they can be about specific kinds of events. That's what I'm trying to say. They can usually indicate specific kinds of support or events that are beneficial, but you just have no way of predicting like exactly what that is as a mundane forecaster. You know what I mean? So, and they're usually carrying a lot less tension. Now, not always. Sometimes they can feel really tense in the way that you feel like you're really going with the flow, and you almost are like stuck in a current or something like that, like going down the river on a pleasure cruise or something. Sometimes they can really feel like you're being swept along like that. But other than that, they feel a little subtler, or a lot subtler to sort of pick out. And if it's going to be between a trine and an opposition, no contest for me most of the time. It's going to be the opposition that you notice over the trine. Maybe you notice both of them together, but it's going to be the opposition that sort of is the one that you want to talk about anyway. Okay, so one more thing that I feel is a good thing to note as to the way that I approach this kind of astrology is I tend to prioritize traditional planets over modern planets. So the first 7 visible planets that Hellenistic or Western ancient astrologers knew about, the modern planets, of course, being Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which we discovered in the modern era. You could refer to them as the outer planets versus the inner planets being the 7 traditional planets. But it's not because I'm a purist. I'm saying, in some lofty way, like I don't look at outer planets because I, am a Hellenistic practicing astrologer. It's not from that kind of lofty idealism that I prioritize traditional planets over outer planets, like they're not as good or something because they weren't used in antiquity. It's more because that the very reason that the traditional planets were known, because they were close enough in the solar system to us that they have the light of the sun reflecting off of them, and so we can see them in the sky. And I feel like that distinction between actually being able to look out into the sky and see a traditional planet with the naked eye, if weather permits and whatever conditions are right, the ability to see the planet is symbolically conducive to also having that be more bold or somehow apparent, right? And literally apparent. Whereas, of course, the outer planets, you can't see them without telescopes. Even with telescopes, they're hard to see unless you have really great telescopes. So I feel like just the inherent nature of the non-visible or modern planets sort of lend a symbolic connection with things that are way more subtle, way more drawn out, and perhaps into some kind of notion that they're happening more unconsciously or deeper or something like that. So by the very nature of the light and the symbolism around light and darkness, I'm going to prioritize planets that are in the light because I feel like those stand out literally and symbolically more than planets that don't. So, for instance, this week we're having Venus making a conjunction to Neptune. And we're also having the sun form a trine with Jupiter. What is this? the fourth week or so of the month of January 2025. If you're watching this later than that, I'm going to pick the Sun trine Jupiter because even though it's a trine, I can see the Sun, I can see Jupiter, and for me, that it could be a gamble. Maybe I'll get this wrong, but you have to contextualize it. But I feel like that's the astrology that is going to stand out a little bit more than a conjunction. I feel like the conjunction is going to be noticeable between Venus and Neptune 100%. I feel like it's going to bring in a kind of instinctual urge to maybe indulge or sort of take it easy more or something like that. Like maybe more of an emphasis on let's have a bit of a more relaxing or pleasurable week that we want to sort of have as an experience this week rather than maybe really hitting it hard or something like that. I feel like that could definitely be a very powerful feeling that sort of sweeps over one, for instance, between the two aspects. But I think it is going to be the Sun trine Jupiter this week that is the aspect more in our minds or more consciously maybe noticeable or something like that. So it's kind of a call, it's like a call. It's like, do you talk about the thing that is more instinctual or do you talk about the thing that is more noticeable? And for me, like I say, this is just my approach. I think both are worth talking about, but if you're going to maybe only talk about one, my approach has been to do the one that's more noticeable. That's maybe not the right approach, but that's just kind of the way that I've leaned so far. So, okay. And a couple of final things with this approach that I have is that I feel like anybody that is going to practice mundane world astrology, a really, really important thing to do is to learn from the experience. Look at the chart for the month or the week or whatever you're doing. Make a prediction, make your selections, make a few predictions, and then hold those in your mind and try to experience the week and see what actually ended up being the thing that was more noticeable or seemed to hit, or what didn't hit, what maybe you left out or something like that. But it's sort of the learning after the forecast that is really, really important and creates that feedback loop that helps you understand, okay, wow, boy, I was off this week. I should have talked about that. Or boy, I should have, this interpretation that I had was really complicated and it could have been a lot more simple or whatever it is. But the learning from the experience is really, really crucial. And I say that it's good to do it through journaling somehow, because just for me, I don't have a great memory. So I can't remember all kinds of stuff. I learn something, I forget something. It just kind of goes in and out. So for me personally, I have to journal it so I have a reference. But if you're smart enough that you just don't need to be reminded of something and you just know what it is because you've been through it, that's great. I wish I had that ability, but I don't. But in any case, I think either way, journaling is a great way to do it. Journaling is just the way that you could describe it as just keeping track of it somehow. Typing, whatever you want to do. I actually keep little flashcards and I'll just write a little flashcard. Now, one caveat to the journaling thing is, and this actually brings us into the last point that I think is a really important point, maybe almost one of the most important points out of this whole thing that I'm talking about today, is that you got to be really careful about trying to make anything fit a narrative. I think it's the biggest pitfall and makes for the bad kinds of astrology that are easy to make. Now, when I say bad astrology, I'm not actually saying that from a judgmental, holier than, or like I'm better than you kind of astrologer. But bad astrology happens, I think, when we have good intentions. We mean well. We want to make good astrology, of course. Who doesn't want to make great astrology? But when you fall into the very, very easy pitfall of making anything fit a narrative, if you think about um, the statistics of, or let's just say it more simply, um, how many things are happening every second around the world, right? Is it such a big number we couldn't even quantify it? Like in 1 minute, how many trillions of things are occurring? How many forest fires, floods, catastrophes, tornadoes, lightning strikes, people falling in love, people breaking up, people losing their jobs, people, you know, somebody's dreams coming true, accidents, injuries, wars, um, good things, bad things. How many things are happening? And one thing I have to be honest about that I am really not a fan of, I'm really, really not a fan of content that astrologers try to make where they go, okay, we're going to talk about this thing in astrology, and let's go back in time um, and look for something that fits that. Well, and I'll tell you, I'll be honest. I myself used to do this all the time, but it just doesn't sit with me well, because when you think about the fact that if you're looking for a Venus retrograde story in Aries, right, and um, you're saying, okay, there's these um, there's these narratives that sort of fit all of those things, right? We've got Venus going backwards, and we've got it in this Mars ruled Aries sign that's kind of fiery, and blah blah blah, right? Okay, well, let's go back 8 years ago, and we're gonna see if there's something that fits all of that. And not that that is even an incorrect way to practice astrology. I'm not even saying that that is wrong, or you shouldn't do that. I'm not even saying that that isn't going to be a great example if you find one. Maybe it is. Maybe it's like you nailed it. You hit it on the head. That's absolutely a perfect archetypal narrative that was very noticeable because of the reflected astrology at that moment with Venus, blah, blah, blah. But what I'm saying is that with so many things always happening in the world, I think there is the danger of being able to source something that's going to fit, right? If you're looking for a catastrophe, you're going to find if you're looking for a catastrophe in the ocean with naval ships because it's Mars and Neptune or something, you're going to find it. You're going to find it. So, and if you do find it, like I say, maybe that's a great legitimate way to do that. But I have a problem with that because I feel like it's so easy to make something fit, to jam something in and go, there it is. Do you see it? I proved it. There it is. There you go, right there. That's what I'm talking about. Maybe, but maybe not. Maybe if you were talking about a Sun Neptune thing instead of Saturn Venus thing, maybe you would have used the same example or occurrence to fit the narrative of a different alignment or a different planetary transit or something. I sort of wonder if that happens a lot, and I think that could be lending itself to what I would say is bad astrology. Bad astrology is when astrology happens because we force something to fit a narrative and we go, there it is. And I think that it's so easy to do. And I think that most people that practice astrology do it a lot. I'm not judging anybody for doing it or saying anybody's bad for doing it. What I'm saying is that um, walking a tightrope is hard. And if it was easy, everybody could do it. But there are some inherently difficult things about it, right? The balance is really hard. I think for doing mundane astrology, practicing mundane astrology, I think that that's the inherent difficulty in mundane astrology. Perhaps even all forms of astrology, that's kind of a pitfall. But for me, I feel like in mundane astrology, that is a really, really, really inherently difficult part about doing it. Is you just have to be as careful as you can. I don't even know what I'm not sure what method you could use to sort of keep away from falling into that pitfall. I think that perhaps the only thing that that might work to sort of avoid falling into that pit is simply just to be aware that you have to be really careful about forcing something into a narrative. You have to ask yourself the question, well, this seems like it fits this aspect or whatever, but am I just forcing something? Like just double check if it feels forced. And then maybe it's not necessary to be so specific, or at the very least, let's say this. I think it's always prudent just to add in there, maybe this is the thing we're looking for, maybe not. Just put in the maybe, just be humble with it. Don't, I would caution against just saying, there it is, like, boom, you've got it. Okay, I'll see you next time on the podcast or whatever. Like, just add in a little bit, like, I feel like this is the thing that is going along with this narrative, but it might not be, or something. Like, just a little bit of humility, I think, maybe at least gives the audience or the person listening to the forecast to know that at the end of the day, it is sort of guesswork, because you can't be totally 100% sure due to the fact that there are so many things happening all at once, and there is a danger of making something fit a narrative that can easily happen with astrology, mundane forecasting. So that is, I feel like, one of the more challenging parts of mundane forecasting. Now, I think you can just be a little bit aware of it, and that can really help. For instance, let's think about this. Let's say that you're going to try to go back and look through some news articles and say, okay, well, I'm looking for something like this for this aspect that happened 8 years ago or something. Let's see if that mirrors the astrology I'm looking for. Well, my question would be, let's say you find a good example. Okay, but did you look at the real-time chart? What other astrology was happening at that same time, right? If you're looking for something very specific, is it prudent to know that there are other specific things astrologically in effect? If you're looking for a really isolated particular aspect or thing in astrology, maybe it takes a little bit more work to find a period where, okay, like with Venus retrograde in Aries, if we're looking for Venus retrograde in Aries things, is there a time where Venus is retrograde in Aries in the past, and you're looking at something to fit that perhaps during the whole retrograde, there is a pretty quiet chart. There's not a lot of other aspects happening. And you're like, wow, here's a couple of days where it seems like there's not too many alignments happening. What's some news around that particular time period? That might be a lot more work, but it might lead to something that fits the sort of the specific case example that you're looking for. So again, kind of difficult. And I'm not here to judge anybody or say that anybody's doing anything wrong, but I just think that that is a pitfall, very easy to fall into. And I think we just have to watch out for us all. So that is the way that I approach mundane world astrology. I hope you guys found something interesting in this. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this. And I'll be back again next week and we'll take a look at some more astrology. Until then, I hope you have a great week and bye for now.